Hey guys, welcome back to Critical Thinking. This series of videos is about fallacies or arguments that do a poor job of proving their conclusion. In this video, we're going to look at some additional informal fallacies. Loaded language is a fallacy in which the argument, instead of giving a substantive reason to believe the conclusion, so some fact that helps justify the conclusion, you're just trying to trigger an emotional reaction in the audience and use that emotion to get them to agree with you. So here's an example. Changing the law to permit physician-assisted suicide is a nihilistic move that treats human lives like so much garbage to be thrown away when they're no longer convenient to keep around. So there's several instances of loaded language in this argument. You can see the word nihilistic or nihilistic, depending on how you pronounce it. This is a word that means that you believe nothing exists, or in this context, nothing is morally valuable. So it's a type of philosophical position denying the existence of a particular kind of thing or things in general. Now, the thing to keep in mind with loaded language is a lot of terms are not always loaded. It depends on the context. So if you're talking about nihilism in a purely philosophical context, just trying to discuss the position, it's not necessarily loaded. In this case, though, it's being used as a kind of slur on people who support physician-assisted suicide right. So the idea is if they support this, then they have a belief in no moral value whatsoever. So that's usually not true for people who have this position. So in this context, it's being used to exaggerate the position. It's being used as a loaded language. Another example is garbage. So oftentimes loaded language will try to trigger powerful negative emotional reactions. It can be either positive or negatively charged loaded language. However, psychologically speaking, there's something called negativity bias, in which people, according to psychologists, tend to remember more and emphasize negative emotions rather than positive emotions. This is one of the reasons, for example, why campaign ads often go negative, because they do have a larger psychological effect on audiences than positive ads. So in this case, they're using the term garbage to try to elicit a disgust reaction in the audience. Disgust is one of the powerful types of negative emotional response you can have. Others include, anger, fear, things like that. And even look at the last clause of this argument, to be thrown away when they're no longer convenient to keep around. So this is kind of implying that people who support the right to physician-assisted suicide are just being kind of lazy, or they're just trying to get rid of older people or people who have health problems because it's too much bother to do so. So the thing about loaded language is that it's often combined with other fallacies. So if you're doing the critical thinking course, only use loaded language when no other fallacy term applies. If there's loaded language, there could also be another fallacy going along. This one's kind of non-specific because it gets combined with others so often. So basically, you should only use it as a solution to a problem if it's the only fallacy that fits. Mere redescription is a version of begging the question, in which the conclusion merely restates or paraphrases a premise. So remember, begging the question is the fallacy in which the conclusion is already in the premises somehow. So you're not really giving a premise that's an independent reason for believing the conclusion. You're just restating the same proposition as both premise and conclusion. Here's an example of that. The reason why she's the best person for the job is because there's no one better. We have the premise indicator because. However, if you look at what follows the because, there's no one better, it's basically just restating or redescribing the conclusion. She's the best person for the job. So this counts as an instance of the mere redescription fallacy. Non sequitur literally means not following in the Latin. This is a fallacy of relevance, an argument that fails because the conclusion is not sufficiently logically relevant to the premises. So here's an example. Religion gives great comfort to people and causes them to do good things. Therefore, God is real. If you look at the premise, it's about what psychologically comforts people and about what belief in religion causes them to do. Even if that's completely true, it doesn't prove, logically speaking, that God is real. So it's not logically relevant to that conclusion. You could use that to prove that religion is therefore beneficial, maybe try to use it to prove that religion should be promoted, but logically it doesn't actually prove that God is real. So the thing about non sequitur is that it's kind of a generic catch-all term for a fallacy of relevance. And in general, you only want to use this name for a fallacy if no other more specific fallacy of relevance applies. So basically, non sequitur is something to keep in your back pocket, and you're only going to use it as a solution to a problem or even in daily life if you can't find a more specific fallacy term that applies. Because you could say about all fallacies of relevance that they don't follow. The conclusion is not logically connected to the premise. Overgeneralizing is also called hasty generalization. So this is an argument that attempts to prove a generalization using too few examples or a non-representative set of examples. So a generalization is any claim, any proposition about a group, class, or set of things. It does not have to be about people. It could be about atoms, could be about animals, could be about stars, anything you could make some claim about what the properties are. So overgeneralizing, hasty generalization is a term that implies you only have a small number of examples. And that's usually the way this fallacy is used. So I think, though, it is somewhat ambiguous in terms of its meaning. It could be also used to refer to cases where you do have a fairly large set of examples, a fairly large sample size, but it's non-representative. You have some reason for believing it doesn't represent the entire group you're generalizing about, and therefore you could still use overgeneralizing fallacy. It's a name for when you make a logical error when trying to reason about the properties of a population from looking at those of an example or a small number of examples. So here's a case of overgeneralizing. Housing and Urban Development, our HUD Secretary Ben Carson, who's a Republican, has claimed that the Egyptian pyramids were not built as tombs for pharaohs, but were instead built by the biblical patriarch Joseph to store grain. Republicans ignore science and stick to their own irrational religious beliefs. So the first proposition is the premise, the second is the conclusion. Perhaps Carson in this case is indeed ignoring the science and sticking to his own irrational religious beliefs. But even if that's true of this one example, it doesn't necessarily make it true of all Republicans. Now, remember, for all these fallacies, it's always possible that the conclusion is true. I'm not saying that Republicans are immune to this or that they don't actually as a whole ignore science, whatever. It's kind of irrelevant to whether this example is a fallacy, because in a fallacy, the premises don't give you good reason for believing the conclusion. This doesn't mean the conclusion is false. It just means that if the conclusion is true, this argument doesn't show it. So it would have to be true for some other reason. So keep that in mind whenever you're looking at an argument. Just because the conclusion is true, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not a fallacy. Overlooking alternatives is an argument that fails to account for the fact that there are alternative explanations for a given phenomenon. So this is the type of fallacy that applies when you're trying to figure out what the cause or explanation is for a given fact. Here's an example from A Workbook for Arguments. Batman is clearly a criminal. Why else does he wear a mask? Why does he conceal his identity? He hides who he is because he's an outlaw. And think about this. Whenever we hear about Batman or see pictures of him, he is with criminals. Only a criminal would spend so much time with other criminals. One thing I'd like to point out is the word because here. Because is often a premise indicator in an argument. This use of the word because in the phrase because he's an outlaw is actually not doing that. It's indicating an explanation. So this is an explanatory because as opposed to a justificatory or argument because, premise indicator because. In an explanation, you're saying that the thing that's doing the explaining, what's called the explanans, is the reason why something else is true in terms of what caused it or what brought it about. But when you're doing an explanation, the thing you're trying to be explaining, it's called the explanandum, that's not something that you're trying to prove logically. So that's the difference between an argument and an explanation. An argument is trying to prove the conclusion. An explanation takes it for granted that the thing you're explaining is true. It's just trying to give you the reason why it's true or the cause for why it's true. So this is an argumentative fallacy that applies to arguments trying to prove some explanation is the correct one. All right, so there are premises in the argument. It's just in this case that because does not indicate the premise of the argument. It indicates what it's trying to prove, that the reason why Batman has these behaviors is because he's an outlaw. That's the cause of those behaviors. But This argument commits a fallacy because it's saying this is the only possible explanation for those observations. And clearly there are other possible explanations. So maybe he's hiding his identity to keep himself safe from retaliation by the people he's attacking, safe from criminals. Persuasive definition is an argument that tries to prove its conclusion through the use of a definition that's biased or has loaded language. So here's an example. Evolution is the atheistic theory that species develop as a result of mere chance events over a supposed period of billions of years. So this one is basically an argument that commits loaded language. There could also be some other type of subtle cognitive bias present in the definition that causes it to try to argue for a conclusion without actually giving the argument. It just kind of includes the argument within the definition. So either way, it counts as a persuasive definition fallacy. You'll notice some loaded language in this particular case, the atheistic theory. Now, the term atheism or atheistic is not always loaded. It could be used just to neutrally describe the philosophical position that there is no God. However, in this case, it's being used as a kind of slur. This is effective because atheists are often not that highly regarded in society in general. So you're basically trying to say that this theory is bad because it's an atheistic theory, or the people who believe it are likely to be atheists. Notice the phrase mere chance events. The word mere chance is implying that there's no fundamental explanation for the course of evolution provided by evolutionary theory. When in fact, that's not exactly right. If you look at evolution by natural selection, they do provide mechanisms, natural selection. There's other types of selection too, like sexual selection. So they actually do provide mechanisms. It's not just an appeal to chance. Over a supposed period of billions of years. So the word supposed is trying to create doubt or uncertainty around the time frame of the evolution of life on Earth, in this case, without actually giving an argument. So it's just trying to create kind of like a veil of uncertainty. So this is a three different instances of loaded language in that definition. The picture on the right, by the way, is just an illustration of some of the different species of finch that Darwin observed in the Galapagos Islands. And this was partly what gave him the idea for evolution by natural selection, because he knew the finches were descended from a common ancestor, and yet they were highly specialized in terms of what they were feeding upon. So that affected their beak size and shape. And presumably it's because the ones who had superior beaks to feed upon their food source, given that particular ecosystem, those are the ones that successfully passed on their traits to the next generation and so on. Poisoning the well is an argument that uses loaded language to disparage an argument before even mentioning or discussing it. So it's a metaphor for like an invading army that would try to poison the wells of areas it had invaded so that the people there or the army, other armies, couldn't draw from that well. This is actually a tactic that was used in ancient times. I don't think it's still used today, but I could be wrong. So poisoning the well metaphorically is when you're trying to say that any argument that comes from this source is not worth listening to. So there's just no point in even listening to the argument. You're trying to tune out your mind before the argument or evidence has even been given. So here's an example of that just from the Dilbert comic. This is the best plan in the world, and anyone who disagrees is an ignorant nuisance. Now, I'll open it up for comments. Anyone? Anyone? I'd like to thank you for shortening this meeting. So you can see the poisoning the well fallacy happens on the first panel. He's saying that anyone who disagrees is an ignorant nuisance. So you're trying to say that there's no plausible reason for objecting to the plan, and anyone who comes up with the reason, they're just being a nuisance. Post hoc ergo propter hoc means after which, therefore, because of which in Latin. So this is a type of fallacy about causation. It's an argument that assumes because one event followed another, it must have been caused by the other. Here's an example. The day after I went to the doctor, I came down with a cold. I'm never going back there again. Now, the conclusion would be something like, therefore, going to the doctor caused the cold. Now, the thing to keep in mind about this particular example is, of course, it's totally possible that a person got a cold from going to a doctor's office. After all, there's often other sick people there. You're interacting with other people. However, keep in mind the mere fact that one happened before the other doesn't guarantee the first caused it. In truth, most of us are exposed to lots of microbes throughout the day. So it could have been any number of interactions that caused you to get sick with a cold, or perhaps you already were exposed to the virus or the bacteria even before you went to the doctor's office and it just took a while to incubate in your system. So people commit this type of fallacy all the time when they're trying to reason about getting sick, what the cause was. Another example of this type of thing is someone gets nauseous and vomits or otherwise after going to a restaurant. They may conclude it was because of eating at the restaurant that caused them to get sick, when it's possible they had a virus already in them that just took a while to manifest. It could have been any number of factors, not necessarily food poisoning, for example. So this is something to keep in mind. In this particular fallacy about causation, there has to be a sequence of events, one before the other. Usually it's a sequence. Sometimes things happen at the same time. Those are the two possibilities. And what you're doing is you're reasoning that because one event happened right before the other or sometime before it, it must have been the cause of the other. The red herring fallacy is arguing that a conclusion is true by introducing an irrelevant premise that diverts attention from the original issue. So here's an example. You know, I've begun to think there's some merit in the Republicans' tax cut plan. I suggest that you come up with something like it, because if we Democrats are going to survive as a party, we have got to show that we are as tough-minded as Republicans, since that is what the public wants. So this is a red herring fallacy because the conclusion is that Democrats should adopt something like the Republicans' tax cut plan, but the premises are actually about not whether the plan is effective, so whether it has merit as a tax cut plan, but about what would be effective politically for the Democrats. And those are two separate issues. So the original issue that's introduced is whether this tax cut plan has merit, you might say, as a matter of policy or the economy. And the premises are all about something else, whether getting a plan like it or supporting a plan like it would benefit the Democrats politically. There's a logical disconnect there between what the original issue is and what the argument's premises are about. And keep in mind, you could reverse the name of the political parties here, and it's the same basic fallacy. Suppose you reran the argument something like, I've begun to think there's some merit in the Democrats' tax plan. We Republicans have to show that we're sympathetic to the poor or people going through this economic crisis, whatever. So the original issue is about whether it's a good policy for the country or the economy. And if you introduce premises about whether it's politically desirable, that's a separate issue. It's a red herring fallacy. And keep in mind with these fallacy examples that come up with political parties, it doesn't really matter whether you agree with the conclusion or not. You have to be able to step outside of yourself, whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, and look at the argument purely objectively. So I personally am neither Republican or Democrat. I still have political ideology and political biases. So that's a technique that we all need to work on psychologically in order to become a better critical thinker. If you like a conclusion, it does not mean that the argument for it is a fallacy. It doesn't mean the conclusion is true also just because you like it. But even if you think the conclusion is true, you need to be able to look at the argument objectively and see where that argument does a good job arguing for the conclusion, because it could have a true conclusion but a bad argument. Similarly, you need to be able to evaluate the arguments of people on your side objectively, and you'll be able to point out cases where, okay, this person supports similar positions to me, but the argument they're giving is not good. So it's kind of like a general skill. In addition to knowing the definitions of the fallacies, being able to train your mind in such a way as to try to be objective as possible and not just so attached or clingy to your political, religious, and other beliefs or ideologies. The straw man fallacy is attacking an argument by falsely characterizing the conclusion, the premises, or both. The name straw man comes from the custom of creating a replica or effigy of a person that you don't like and beating or burning the effigy, the straw man, instead of the real person. So this is an example of if you really think someone's a bad person, but you can't beat them or attack them literally, physically, directly, you might try to vent your frustration or demonstrate your beliefs by creating this dummy version of them that you beat. In the straw man fallacy, what you're doing is creating a dummy version of your opponent's argument. You're making it so it's easier for you to attack it, either by making it the conclusion more extreme or the premises more outlandish or less plausible. So here's an example of that. Opponents of affirmative action want to take us back to the days of Jim Crow laws and segregation. We must support affirmative action in order to prevent a return to the bad old days of Jim Crow. So Jim Crow is a reference to the United States laws in the South before the Civil Rights era, where it was basically legally permitted, some in cases legislated as required, to segregate people or to discriminate them on the basis of their race. So the reason why this argument commits the straw man fallacy is affirmative action is different from segregation. Affirmative action is saying that some people from traditionally oppressed or marginalized groups should get additional representation either in employment or government positions, etc., or at universities. So this is different from segregation because you're not saying that the people who oppose affirmative action are not saying that we should reinstate segregation. They're just saying that people should be treated equally and historically marginalized groups or oppressed groups should not get any advantage in university admissions, hiring for government or private sector positions, etc. So these are really two different positions, and this argument is basically trying to taint opponents of affirmative action by associating them with this much more extreme policy of segregation. So those are the fallacies covered in a workbook for arguments. However, the list, even though it's pretty extensive, leaves out some very common and important fallacies that you need to be able to recognize as a critical thinker. So I'm going to go over some of those briefly. Appeal to authority is ad verecundiam. This is an argument that a conclusion is true just because an authority asserts it as true. The authority could be a person or a text or a group of people. So here's an example. My pastor says that the world was created in 6 days. Therefore, the world was created in 6 days. The Bible says that Jesus is the Son of God. Therefore, Jesus is the Son of God. So these two examples both happen to be about religion, but this does not only apply to religion. It could apply to appeal to any authority that's inappropriate, who doesn't have a genuine expertise about a topic, or even if they have expertise, they are using it in an unreasonable way. So maybe they're going outside of their field and making the comment, or they're making the comment not based upon their expert knowledge of the field, but just based on personal prejudice. All of these could be versions of the appeal to authority fallacy. And it can happen with religious authorities, political authorities, scientific authorities, celebrities, people who, in other words, who have a high status within popular culture, etc. And the thing to keep in mind about all these fallacies is that there can be versions of them that are actually good arguments. So what this means is that some of the fallacies are things that make an argument weak. They give only a low probability of the conclusion based on the premises. But you could have other arguments that share the same general form but don't commit the fallacy. So in terms of appeal to authority, that would be appealing to an authority that really is an expert source on this topic. So for example, if a medical doctor says, based on your symptoms, I believe you have heart disease, it doesn't logically guarantee that you have heart disease. The physician could be making a mistake. However, because this is their area of expertise, their conclusion is highly probable based on the reasons that they give. Or even if you say that because the physician said it, because they're a relevant authority, therefore what they said is probably true. So it doesn't make it a logically valid argument, but it does make it logically strong. So consider that there could be stronger versions of this general type of reasoning, but what makes it a fallacy in these cases is that the authority doesn't actually have relevant expertise or doesn't make the conclusion highly probable. So the mere fact that the pastor said something, this is something that is not just about the beliefs of their religion. I mean, it is, but it oversteps also things that could be studied scientifically. So the age of the world, that's a scientific question. So even if the pastor is correct that their religion says the world was created in 6 days, this does not actually mean they give you a strong reason to believe it. All that means is they give you a strong reason to believe that's what their religion teaches. Similarly with the Bible and other sacred scriptures, it's possible that everything the Bible says is true. That's logically possible. However, that's still going to be a version of the appeal to authority fallacy, because basically whether the Bible is an authority of that kind is highly contested. So this might count as a good argument within a very select circle of people who already believe the Bible is an authoritative source for all information or all knowledge. But outside that circle, in other argumentative contexts, it's not going to be an effective argument. And even if you regard something as an effective source or a valid source, keep in mind that you always want to double check the credentials of the source. Keep in mind also that even if it is a true expert, it still can be wrong, right? So it's not the case that someone who's a scientist is always going to be correct when making claims about their field. That's why we have a scientific method in the first place, to try to check things out based on peer review, the work of other scientists, etc. The appeal to force or odd baculum fallacy is arguing that a conclusion is true based on some threat to the listener or audience. So you better believe it, because if you don't, I'm going to harm you in some way. It doesn't have to be violence. It could be just threatening their interests in some way. By the way, the name of the fallacy in Latin, ad baculum, means basically appeal to the stick. It's basic, or the baton. It's basically threatening to beat someone up with a stick or baton if they don't agree with you. So here's an example. I deserve to get a good grade because if you give me a bad grade, I cannot guarantee your safety. So it's making kind of a threat there at the end. Another example could be just like threatening someone's interests, like a parent who says, you better agree with me because if you don't, then I'm going to ground you. That's not a literal physical threat to their child, but it is a threat to their interest to be able to go out and have fun with their friends or whatever. And then the fallacy of composition is paired with another fallacy, division. They're kind of like logical converses of each other. Fallacy of composition says you're attributing a property of a part of an object to the object as a whole. So you're making an argument that because the parts or the part has this property, therefore the whole also has that property. Here's an example. You used only the best ingredients to make this cake. Therefore, this cake is the best. So even if the ingredients are very high quality, it doesn't mean the cake as a whole is very high quality, right? Because the ingredients may have been combined in the wrong way. Imagine, for example, that this cake has flour, but they forgot to put the sugar in the actual cake batter. Now, who knows? Maybe this really is the best cake. After all, it is a pretty bodacious unicorn with the golden horn, etc. However, it's still a fallacy, right? Because the ingredients, they're being the best, that does not prove that the cake is the best. And finally, fallacy of division. This is attributing a property of an object as a whole to the parts of the object. So you're saying because it's true of the whole, therefore it must also be true of the parts. Here's an example. She's very intelligent, therefore she must have very smart neurons. So intelligence, you might say, is largely based on the neurons as a whole, how they're connected, perhaps how many of them there are, etc. However, the fact that someone's intelligent does not mean that their individual neurons are also intelligent. That's a fallacy. And even if it turns out that they do have exceptional neurons for some reason, the argument is still bad, logically speaking. The fact that you as a whole, as a person, are intelligent, it doesn't mean that specific parts of you physiologically or anatomically are intelligent.